state lawmakers have officially blown past their deadline to pass a budget in time for the new fiscal year. It's something of an annual tradition here in Massachusetts. The state government has failed to get a budget in place in time for the new fiscal year every year since 2010. Current spending levels have been extended to cover the gap, but as of now, state departments and organizations are in the dark about how much money they'll have to work with in the year ahead. Lawmakers still haven't found a path forward on a long-awaited tax package either, leaving a lot still up in the air. So where does the budget debate stand now? And what kind of impact do these delays have on the state? To discuss, I am joined now by Lisa Kashinsky, author of Politico's Massachusetts Playbook, and Doug Howgate, president of the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation. Doug, Lisa, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And Doug, I want to start with you. It's been a long time now since Massachusetts has managed to start the fiscal year with a full budget in place. We, of course, have these interim budgets, so we don't have a threat of a government shutdown like you hear about in Washington. But with that in mind, does it matter that we're entering, fiscal 2024 without a budget in place?
So I think there's a couple ways to think about that. I think the most important thing, as you referenced, is are government provision of services going to continue? Can people continue to access government as they would in a normal day? And the answer to that is yes. And so it's not that when the clock strikes 12 on June 30th, all of a sudden people can't, do what or access what government does. I think the challenge is more like any deadline. When you kind of go past it 1 year, go past it another year, go past it another year, you run a greater and greater risk that if there's a real breakdown in negotiations, you could end up with a significantly delayed budget, which then does start to impact provision of services. We saw that probably about 20 years ago, and we haven't seen it since then, and hopefully we won't this year as well. But I think that's the big concern as you start to kind of creep past that deadline. It's not necessarily the day-to-day. It's really kind of what happens if there's a breakdown, and then all of a sudden it's significantly delayed. I will also say it is something, it's part of what credit rating agencies and others look at when they consider the fiscal health of the Commonwealth. It's certainly not the only thing, and the state recently got a credit rating upgrade, but it is one of those factors too.
Absolutely. I know a few years ago, the credit rating agency Moody's warned Massachusetts and other states with late budgets that it's a sign of government weakness to have that continually drag on. Lisa, from your perspective, do people on Beacon Hill see it that way? Are they worried about the fact that there's a pattern of late budgets?
Beacon Hill lawmakers are really kind of greeting this with a shrug right now. It's funny because I reached out to some longer-time state lawmakers, as in people who were in the legislature back when the budgets did pass on time before 2010. And I was like, maybe they're upset about this. Maybe they'll say something about this, that this is bad for government or something like that. And they all kind of greeted it with a shrug. It's so par for the course on Beacon Hill at this point, and especially because there is that interim budget in place that at least keeps things moving. While some people who need state funds are in limbo, at least the state, as we've said, isn't shutting down. But even seasoned lawmakers who know what it's like to have a budget on time are just kind of shrugging their shoulders and moving on.
Right. And I do want to note that negotiations have started. They're underway. It's not like people are just sitting around. So I want to ask both of you, but Lisa, maybe I'll stick with you. What do you see as some of the sticking points between the House and the Senate as they try to iron out a final budget?
One of the interesting things, and this is something that's gotten a lot of attention already, is online lottery. There are a lot of policy sections that are attached to the budget and things that like allowing for online lottery. And the House wants this, the governor wants this, and the Senate doesn't want it. And it's something that we have to keep in mind here. Like some things the different chambers won't put in their budgets, their budget proposals as bargaining chips. And then there's some things that they're really against. And I'm curious how that one goes in particular, because the Senate has always been the more reluctant chamber when it comes to kind of expanding gambling options. We saw that with sports betting, where they did pass it eventually, but it was with kind of a lot of pushing and shoving and reluctance and other horse trading that went with it. So that's something that I'm curious to see how it goes. And also permanent funding for free school meals, something that the House included, but the Senate and the governor have thought about doing through, other types of spending plans.
Doug, I know you at Mass Taxpayers Foundation look pretty closely at the differences between the two budgets. What do you see as some of the major ones?
Sure. So I'd echo what Lisa said in a couple places. Normally you have to reconcile spending differences. And the way a budget normally works is the revenue templates that the House and Senate use are pretty similar, where spending can differ more. And so what usually happens when you have to reconcile those two budgets is you have to prioritize. And some spending things aren't going to make it in that final budget. That's always a challenge. And it's kind of enhanced this year because of spending related to the surtax, which is where that universal school meals comes in, some different spending provisions on the MBTA, higher education. So those would be some real kind of spending areas where I think it just takes a little time and complication to resolve. And then policy, you don't see as many policy sections, certainly the first year of a governor's administration, first year of a legislative session. But as Lisa mentioned, whether it's in-state tuition for undocumented immigrants, online lottery, a few of those things, there are some notable policy areas that's in one branch, not in the other. So how do you compromise and kind of make a deal within that?
Sure, and you're referring to the state's new tax on incomes over $1 million.
Exactly.
And that's one kind of tax policy wrinkle we have going on this year. The other is that both branches of the legislature have passed tax relief packages. That's also being negotiated. And I want to ask you, Lisa, about a theory I've been kind of batting around and see what you think. I've been wondering if the tax relief negotiations and the budget negotiations, which involve some of the same players, are going to be linked, where we might not see one bill get finalized until we see the other. What do you think about that?
I would say that's a pretty safe bet. I mean, that's sort of what we've seen before, where you have the same two people, the House and Senate Ways and Means chairs who are leading negotiations on both. They are sort of already linked, in terms of through the budget. The Senate had carved out, the nearly $600 million for it in their budget. So these were linked going into negotiations. And that's sort of how it ended up last year, where we saw the budget and then we saw the tax relief package, kind of in quick succession. And ultimately, of course, that got derailed last session because of other factors. But, these really are kind of linked, and I would expect to see them come in pretty rapid succession when lawmakers do reach agreements on them.
Right. And Doug, when we're talking about a budget that's upward of $50 billion, how big a deal is this kind of tax relief question when it's, a few $100 million or?
In any budget, the vast, vast, vast majority of spending proposals are going to be common between the two budgets. So it really usually is about between $1 billion and $800 million of difference, which is where a lot of the discussion negotiation takes place. I think the good news is on the tax relief proposal, both budgets kind of account for about $600 million in relief in fiscal year 2024, which is the upcoming year. And we're going to publish something next week that shows you can probably include everything, if you delay implementation of a couple things and still fit within that $600 million kind of budget for tax relief. And so it wouldn't necessarily be the case that you have to include some or not include some, but obviously there are many, many different ways to get to that point. But that could kind of complicate negotiations, exactly as you say.
Oh, that's interesting. I'm going to be staying tuned for that.
Definitely.
And I want to ask you, too, about a recent report the Mass Taxpayers Foundation put out with the conference committee preview looking at the negotiations, in which you highlight really one way that this budget is different from other late budgets, saying this is likely to be the first time in several years where the resources aren't sufficient to support all spending. Do you think that dynamic is something that lawmakers are working through?
Yeah, I mean, I think the important thing to note is this year's budget is pretty standard. What wasn't standard is the last two budgets. So in both of the last two budgets, during this time period, budget makers were able to upgrade revenue assumptions by billions of dollars because we saw about a 40% increase in tax collections over a 2-year period. So you didn't have to make tough decisions necessarily between, are we going to go with this higher number here or this higher number here, because you were able to support it with newfound tax revenue. This is a standard budget where we don't anticipate them really changing the revenue playbook that they need to make all the spending work within. And so when you have different ideas on the Senate and the House, usually for new things or expanded program, it is going to come down again to figuring out how you prioritize those things.
Right. And, Lisa, another difference that we see this year compared to the past couple of years is that we have a new governor in office. We have Maura Healey. We have full Democratic control on Beacon Hill. Do you think that is changing the way lawmakers are approaching their budgeting this year?
I do, yeah. And that's definitely the case if you take kind of the budget and the tax relief plans as a whole. I mean, think about it last year. A lot of the stuff that the current Democratic governor is proposing, especially in her tax relief package, are items that first came from the Republican governor, Charlie Baker, and specifically to focus on the capital gains, the cut to the short-term capital gains rate that's being proposed. That was something that Republican Governor Charlie Baker had put forward and that both the House and Senate said no to. Now that there's a Democrat in the corner office, you have the House saying yes to it, the Senate still saying no, but that's still one chamber that had nixed it last year that's now in favor of it this year. And you can see this in a couple of different ways where lawmakers, just do seem to be a bit more willing now that Democrats have full control on Beacon Hill to move forward with some things that they were a little bit reluctant to do under the Republican governor.
That's right. And I know, of course, once there is a budget deal, Governor Maura Healey will get 10 days to review it, and we'll see what she ultimately agrees with. Doug, can you give me a sense of how different, how far lawmakers might have strayed from the original budget proposal Governor Healey put forward?
I think in many important ways, people often kind of deride a governor's budget as, oh, the House and Senate just ignore that and do their own thing. But when you look at the fundamentals of both the House and the Senate budget, you see the framework that Governor Healey put forward on March 1st, right? Certainly starting with tax relief, both in terms of the scope and the provisions. But then when you look at some of the major proposals for community college for Massachusetts residents 25 and older, the Mass Reconnect program, when you look at investments in workforce, when you look at the continuation of child care operation grants, these were three things that were kind of a big selling point of the governor's budget, and you see those in the House and Senate as well. Now, as you mentioned, you see some unique things in addition. The House universal school meals, policy proposals related to in-state tuition, again, for undocumented immigrants on the Senate side, a lot of spending proposals related maybe to higher education. So there's always some differences. But I think a lot of the kind of bones and foundation of this budget you saw in Governor Healey's original proposal.
Okay, so, that should maybe make it a little easier to review. Maybe you'll see more working around the margins and a tighter focus on smaller things, a lot of ways that could play out. And, as we're talking about this late budget, Lisa, I'm hoping you can explain maybe for our viewers who are watching who might not be as familiar with the process of Beacon Hill, why we don't really know where the negotiations stand and why there is a question mark over everything. The whole process is shrouded in mystery a little bit still at this point.
Yes, it is. And that's because these conference committees, as they're called, these groups of 6 lawmakers, 3 from the House, 3 from the Senate, that are appointed to kind of hash out the differences between bills, both the budget, tax relief, and anything else that comes through the chambers with significant differences. They do this all behind closed doors. When these negotiations start, there's a very brief bit that's kind of open to the public. Reporters get to ask some questions, and then they shut it down. And it all plays out behind closed doors, the lobbying, the negotiations. We don't get to see it as reporters. The public doesn't get to see it, just watching in on Beacon Hill. And it will kind of very quickly emerge at some point with little to no warning. As kind of whatever deal they've been able to hash out. And that's kind of why we don't know where it is. And the lawmakers who are involved in these negotiations really do clam up with reporters. Not that they talk that much before, but it gets particularly quiet when it comes to these very presumably tense and complicated negotiations.
All right, so I guess we'll see what's going to happen there and when a budget emerges and what it looks like. Doug Howgate of the Mass Taxpayers Foundation, Lisa Kashinsky of Politico, Massachusetts Playbook, thank you so much for taking the time to walk through it with us.